So, LiberalViewer posted a video asking whether he thinks the Supreme Court will hold Obamacare to be constitutional. And the main argument that conservatives use against the constitutionality of Obamacare is that the federal government does not have the power to force you to buy a product. Now, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a legal scholar, I'm not actually even an American. I'm just someone who has a near obsessive interest in American judicial review, who has researched this particular question quite a bit. So anything I say should be taken with a grain of salt. Nevertheless, do I think that the Supreme Court will rule that the federal government in the United States does in fact have the power to force people to buy a product under the Commerce Clause? Well, there are a couple of cases that I think actually point in that direction. One judicial precedent cited in defense of the federal government's ability to use the Commerce Clause to regulate individual consumption is Wickard v. Filburn. Now, the gist of this case was that there was a farmer by the name of Roscoe Filburn who was growing more wheat on his farm than was legally allowed at the time. He was prosecuted for this, but he argued that because this wheat that he was growing was for his own personal consumption and that he had no intent on selling it, it's not commerce. It's certainly not interstate commerce. But the point of the law that prohibited growing too much wheat at the time was to keep wheat prices high. And the Supreme Court ruled that even though he was growing that wheat for his own consumption, the fact that he wasn't going out and buying more wheat for his own consumption contributed to lowering the price of wheat generally. And while I wasn't able to find a case specifically where the Supreme Court defended a law saying that you have to buy a product, I think that this particular case shows that the Supreme Court does have a history of ruling in favor of the federal government's ability to regulate interstate commerce by prohibiting a person from providing oneself with a product, thus indirectly coercing them to get that from the market. They ruled that the federal government has the ability to indirectly coerce you to engage in interstate commerce. But you may say that that was back during the Great Depression, that was back during the Commie New Deal days. Nothing like that would pass through the Supreme Court nowadays. Well, in a more recent case, Gonzalez v. Reich, the normally right-leaning Justice Antonin Scalia ruled in favor of the so-called liberal side of the Supreme Court in upholding a law saying that the federal government has the right to prohibit people from growing their own marijuana. Now, in this particular case, someone was prosecuted for growing marijuana in California, where it's actually legal to grow marijuana for your own personal use. In this particular case, the Supreme Court ruled that the federal government, under the same sort of rationale as in Wickard v. Filburn, has an interest in keeping the prices of marijuana, like wheat, high. Now, in this case, instead of trying to keep the price of wheat high to encourage people to grow it, they were trying to keep the price of marijuana high in order to make it more difficult to access marijuana. In both of these cases, Wickard v. Filburn and Gonzalez v. Reich, we have a person who was prohibited from providing themselves with a product because the federal government wanted them to go out and buy that product from the market. And the Supreme Court upheld both cases. So while in neither of these cases is the federal government forcing a person to go out and buy a product, they are sort of indirectly coercing people to go out and buy a product by prohibiting that person from providing that product on their own. Does that mean that they will in fact rule in favor of a law that says you do have to go out and buy a product? Not necessarily, but I think it does point in that direction.